decades of experience working in newspapers. He's the author of about 9 books on subjects such as beer and the bands Midnight Oil and Tumbleweed. Today, he's going to talk to us about his 2019 book, Night Terrors, the true story of the Kingsgrove Slasher. Thank you, Glenn, and over to you.
Yep, I guess I'll tackle the one thing straight off, why a guy who lives in Wollongong and works for the Illawarra Mercury has written a book about the Kingsgrove Slasher. It's because I grew up in Kingsgrove myself, in the same house that my dad lived in, actually during the 3 years that the Slasher was doing his business. He was there with a twin sister and an older sister, so they were obviously quite frightened at the time. But fortunately for them, the house was a fair way outside his normal hunting ground, which was around that Girraween Park, Walleye Creek area. So they never got a visit, thankfully to all of us. And what I'll do is I'll now start the slideshow. Just let you know there's a spoiler alert right at the start. In that first shot we'll see is of the Slasher himself. That's David Scanlan. I don't know if I'm assuming everyone can see that. If I get, yep, cool. It's me at my first go with Zoom. That's David Scanlan, born in 1929. His parents had 3 kids in a short space of time before him. Then there was like an 8 or 9 year gap, which sort of suggests that he might have been an accident rather than anything that was planned. The family reports say he was a quiet child, a fragile child who might not have survived past toddlerhood, but he did. And the later reports of him growing up, so he was highly strung. He moved around a bit with his family because his father was working the railroads at the time, until about his teens when the family moved to Kingsgrove, where they stayed in New England Drive, which is just, I think it's west of Kingsgrove Station. And he was there, and I think one of the things that may well have led him onto the path of what he did happened in 1951 when his mother dies. He comes home from work, walks into the kitchen and effectively trips over her body in the kitchen. And the family reports from the court documents state that his personality changed from that time. He became quite withdrawn and where he wouldn't talk to people very often. And there was a gap between the first crime we get as the Slasher is 1956, and this death, it was in 1951. And he sort of built up in effect. His first starts by just climbing into people's backyards and looking in through windows, just being a peeping Tom. And over time that escalates to, I guess not getting the same thrill out of that. So he climbs into people's houses, watches them sleep. There's claims that he would sit on the chair in the lounge room and watch them as they got up to go to the toilet and then walk back to bed. And then again, over time, that no longer became enough, and he decided to, I guess, start doing what he got his name for, which was slashing, more so bedding and sheets than actual people, though they got cut a few times as well. First one was actually not the only one that wasn't in a house. That was Margaret Campbell, who was parked in a car with a boyfriend along the train line near Beverly Hills. This is obviously back when it was bushland and it was quite secluded. They had the doors open to let the air in because it was a hot night. They'd taken the light out of the interior light out, so there was no light there. He snuck up, cut her across the chest a few times with a razor. She didn't feel anything, it seems, until he actually went off and watched them to see her reaction and got none, so he just left. But she had to go to hospital and get some stitches put in. And then that was March 8, 1956. Second time we get is Magda Stores, who's just a 12-year-old. In July 4, he just climbed into her bedroom and basically just cut a few bed sheets and left. So they didn't really. She woke up and thought it was his she thought it was her sister. She thought it was her brother who'd woken up and was trying to scare her until she realized what was going on. And then July 14 was Leslie Jean Coleman, who was probably the most violent of the attacks. She'd gone out with a boyfriend, and they'd come home. The mum had left the door unlocked so they could get in. They got in, and then the son didn't lock the door properly when they went to bed. So the slasher was out prowling that night and found the door open. Walked in. Looks like he cut a few bits of bedding on other people's beds in the house, and then when he came into Leslie Coleman's room, he actually said he punched her to wake her up. So basically broke her teeth and knocked her into unconsciousness, and she would have choked on the own blood if the parents hadn't got there in time. And then the next one, which is just even worse, is a 7-year-old, Anne Willis, who he cuts through the bedding, and there's some light little grazes upon the girl's body. And since writing the book, she would probably be the only victim who's still alive. And after writing the book, she's actually contacted me and was pleased to find out the book had been written, and she found out the full story and has been able to share it with her family so they've got a better understanding of what she went through as a child. And the funny thing, even with the media attention later on got quite strong with the slasher. But these early cases, I could not find any news clippings at all about any of the crimes. And as I know, as a journalist, these are the sort of things that I would have thought would have got some coverage, but they didn't. I think the first one was actually the 5th crime, Gloria Gayson, who basically had her pajamas slashed, but there was no cuts to her. And we can see these are the sort of headlines that we get, where he's being called a sex maniac or a sex pervert and the like. And she was in Armatory Street, Kingsgrove, as you can see from those headlines, the headlines there. That's more sex slasher, hunt for sex fiend. These are all tabloid headlines because they suddenly realized that this was a story that was going to sell them papers that people were going to want to start reading. And often down the line, as you'll see, it makes front page of a lot of the papers. And in the trial coverage, they devoted 3 or 4 full pages every day to the court covering. And we got another, even this case, we don't know if it was actually the slasher, because the problem throughout the case, again, you get a whole lot of people saying they were visited by the slasher, but the slasher never, when he got caught, never admitted to it. And some of the others sort of just sound a bit fishy, like they've actually been made up. This is an interesting one. This is number 7, Judith Judith Gurney. It's interesting because the slasher said he didn't follow any of these women home, didn't know them. It was just by choice, random chance that he was in their homes. This is interesting because the Gurneys lived 5 doors down from where him and his parents lived. So I just sort of think there's no way possible he couldn't have not known her. He must have seen her in the street, must have walked past her at some stage. And it has another wrinkle that Annette is the first person who actually sees the slasher. Up until this point, no one had had eyes on him or seen him or could give any sort of description. But Annette was able to give it a description, but somehow she didn't recognize him as the guy who lived 5 houses down the road. So you wonder if she did, whether things would have stopped when they did. And some more coverage there. There's Annette Gurney herself. They ran photos of a lot of the victims throughout the pages of the paper at the time, which as a journalist I can tell you we certainly wouldn't be able to do today, especially with the under 10s and the under 18s, the minors. You wouldn't be able to do that. And very early on we get the vigilantes coming out. These are Arthur and Rex Jackson, brothers who live in the same house with their wives, deciding to pose for the paper, holding the guns that they intend on shooting at the slasher if he ever comes around their place. But he did not. And we got the 8th attack, which is Valerie June Thompson. She woke up in the bed. She was in the bed with her husband, wakes up and sees the man standing over a bed, having just slashed her and cut her arm. The husband gets up and chases him out of the house and chases him out into the backyard. but he jumps the fence and gets away. That's telling because Slasher always said he did this because he liked to be chased. And yet this is the only time in his all the 18 crimes he ever actually gets chased by anyone. All the other times he's basically out of the room or gone. Sometimes they don't even know he's in the room and he's left, and they've woken up the next day and found something's happened. So I think the idea that he was doing it so people would track him down and pursue him just doesn't make sense. But now we got, this is Rosalie Meyer, case 9. As you see the headline, Pretty Girl Bashed. It's a bit of an unnerving way they cover things with the teenage victims. They often refer to them as pretty or attractive, vivacious. It just seems like a really, given it's effectively a sexually related crime, and these are minors, it just seems like a really odd, unsettling way to be describing these girls, these victims. She's in Arncliffe, and he came into her room with a block of wood and basically hit her in the face and hit her in the head. And she had to get stitches up over her brow, above here. She was unconscious. And I guess for some time thereafter was sort of really unsettled and couldn't be left alone by the family because she was that worried about what had happened. And around this time, I should say, the slasher, David Scanlan, gets married, which had surprised a lot of psychiatrists who were trying to work out who this person would have been, this slasher. And they all were saying that he would be antisocial, wouldn't be able to have any relationships with women, would keep to himself. But they were largely wrong because he marries a woman named Doreen. And for a while, they're still living in, still living in the area, but they moved to Lavender Bay on the north, just on the North Shore. And even though he's living in Lavender Bay, these last few crimes we've seen are actually still committed in the Kingsgrove area, because it seems either he's come back to his old stomping ground or he's been staying overnight, maybe visiting the family, and he stayed overnight and taken the chance to go out in the wee small hours around his old stomping ground. This is the first one that he commits near his own house. This is in Lavender Bay. It's about 2 blocks from where he was staying at a share house with his wife. That's Georgina Palmer. It's a 14-year-old. Again, today you'd never put the front page of a teenage victim of an assault on the front page of the paper like that. She was basically just cut into clothes. Her clothes were cut and just some blood was drawn from. He climbed up a ladder around the back of these flats she was living in, reached in and used a razor. I should say it was the old safety razors we're talking about, not a cutthroat. It was just a razor blade that he often would get from his wife, actually, because the slasher himself used an electric razor, so he didn't actually have blades for himself. And often, again, something else about the coverage is they would give the victim's full name, a street, and the suburb. So it was effectively, if you really wanted to, it was quite easy to go to these victims' houses and find them and talk to them. And that's exactly what happened with Georgina Palmer. That the next day, as you can see there, this man turned up to the house, said he was a policeman, and started quizzing the mum and Georgina about what had happened. And the mother got quite suspicious about it, rang the cops and found out that he wasn't a policeman at all. And then he ends up, gets charged with impersonating a policeman and has to appear in court himself. So Georgina is number 10 on the list. And we have 11 was Lorraine Cousins in Walker Street, Turrella, who had gone to the beach with her family, had taken off, got changed, taken off her swimsuit, wrapped it up in a towel and put it on the ground at the end of the bed. The next morning she wakes up and finds it's been unraveled and the swimming costume has been slashed to pieces and things have been moved around her room. He was obviously in the room. She had no knowledge that he was there until the next morning. And so she wasn't as put out as some of the other victims. And I think she actually went to work the next day, not really that concerned. And the strange thing we get here is this was December 1956, was the Cousins case. The next one wasn't until March 18, 1958. I did elementary maths. I counted them as 450 days between crimes. It's never really been explained what was going on there, other than Scanlon himself saying he tried to stop for his wife's sake. Whether that's the truth or not, I don't know. Maybe he just couldn't find the time to get away and do it for so long. But it did lead to that long gap, led to the police wondering what had happened to him. Maybe he had been maybe the slasher had been in a psychiatric ward, had been in hospital, had gone overseas. There was also one report that this was the slasher. This was a person who, not long after the 11th crime, was found hanging over his clothesline in the backyard wearing a women's bra, stockings and shoes. And so they figured, well, he died and the crimes had stopped. So maybe he's the reason for it. But obviously, as it turned out, it wasn't, because we got another crime, March 1958. Robin Williams was attacked. She's in Greendale Road, Greenwich, northern suburbs of Sydney. This is where he starts, the violence and the sexual motives start mixing up a bit, because not only does he punch her in the face and gropes her, he also puts his hands around her neck. And there's some concern that he might have been trying to bring her unconscious or do something worse. September 1958, he moves to Arncliffe, back into the stomping ground. And November, he cuts a 63-year-old Margaret Austin. This is probably the deepest cut. It's like a 10, 12-inch cut along the abdomen. She actually had to get rushed to hospital to get stitches put in. The unfortunate thing for her is she was actually living with her son and daughter-in-law at the time, which actually sort of put her closer to the slasher's house than her own place would have been. So if she hadn't been there, there's every chance she might not have been attacked at all. And at this stage, everyone now realised the slasher's back. So the police, who had copped a bit of a hiding for not being able to find him the first time around, actually get serious, and CIB Detective Brian Doyle starts, and he starts the Slasher Squad, Slasher Patrol, which ends up patrolling Girraween Park area. Some have to pretend to be lovers as to spy on him. Others are in the woods in the commandos hiding in the mud to try and work out where he is. And here's some examples of while they're trying to work out who the slasher is. We've got the public getting quite distressed about what's going on. There was this great instance in December in Brett Street where there was a huge crowd of people ran out into the streets trying to find the man, armed with guns and knives and whatnot. Again, more headlines about the fear that is installed into the community. And there's more instances from Brett Street. These are two women who claim they were attacked by the slasher. The woman on the left probably didn't, given that if she's to be believed, the slasher must have spent an hour cutting every piece of material in her bedroom while she sat in the bed doing nothing. Yep, and there's another case of the strangeness in December 1958. It seems to really hit a high point in terms of hysteria in the community. People really worried about what's going on, to the extent that we get more cases of people who think they've been seen by the slasher, but it's unlikely to be. Certainly wasn't claimed by the slasher. More cases, vigilante groups walking the street looking for young men who were out and about after hours. Pretty much at that time, any man who was walking home from the pub or going for a run or what have you would have gotten pulled over by the police and asked a question or two. Again, parents decide to protect their daughters and go out looking for him, the slasher, every night. So much so that a Canadian who got off of the wrong train and didn't know where he was, 1 a.m. went knocking on doors in Birrong and basically scared the living daylights out of everybody there. They called the cops thinking they'd actually had the slasher banging on their doors. And I'll skip through the last two so we can get some question times in. The number 17 victim, that's Mona Summers. He breached in through her window with a razor and slashed her bedding. That's a file footage of that's her house. And you can see in the background, that's the window there. The background is the train line, which runs across there, and Woollow Creek's in the background. And that is now a road, that section there. And the bushland on the other side, to the left of the picture, is now a business. So what he would do generally is run across that train line back into the bush, cut across, come out the other side where other houses were, prowl around a bit more. Then if he was spotted, he'd duck back into the bush again to hide. We got the 18th and the final case, which is Helen Gaffey, where he broke into the house, took a whole lot of clothes outside, spent some time in the backyards, tearing them to pieces, throwing them around the yard, and then went back in and cut her and like several other previous victims that I haven't mentioned. They were also groped. So there's now a much stronger sexual motive than motive of violence. And we see several pages of coverage about the Gaffey murder. There's another claim of someone else, a woman saying that the slasher had attacked her, but it seems that she only got attacked when no one else seemed to be in the house. And the police was quite suspicious that her dog was in the house in one instance and was outside in the backyard in another, and she never barked. The dog never barked. So they were quite dubious that there was actually anyone else in the house at the time. Because they do tend to, some of them seem to drawing attention to themselves, or they're unbalanced and just decide to do these sort of things. Here's another one. She claimed the slasher attacked her in the face with a wire brush, but to me those cuts look very, very superficial, like someone had maybe done it to themselves rather than someone being held down and being attacked with a brush. And this is the first time the police actually look like they're going to catch him. They'd worked out the plan. Detective Doyle had worked out a plan that he was using the Girraween Park area, Woollow Creek, cutting through, as I said earlier, from houses on one side to houses on the southern side, and using the bushland as an escape route. So they had positioned policemen in the bush and at either end of it. So when this happened, they basically called the alarm and said he's coming, and so they were patrolling the area around Turrella Station, and they found him, and then he ducked back into the bush, but they couldn't find him anymore. So but the thing is, they knew their plan was working. They knew what his modus operandi was, what he was trying to do, and unless he stopped, it was only going to be a matter of time, really, before he got caught. And that's pretty much what it was. Sad irony is that they decided to put out a £1,000 reward after the last crime, rather than doing it, after the 9th or 10th, maybe. They will unknowingly have waited till he's almost basically about to get caught before they actually decide to put out a monetary reward. This is a second escape where, second attempt where he got away from police who thought that was him, that was the slasher, and they were actually right. They got very close. This is a woman who tried to claim, it's Frida Grafton. She tried to claim the reward, that $1,000 reward, saying that her call was instrumental in the slasher's later capture, as we'll see, but the police chief decided no, the police were already around in the area. They would have got him anyway, so she missed out on the £1,000 reward. Here we got three cases of the 3 reports of the arrest. This is from the Sydney Morning Herald, who was on hiding to nothing because their deadlines would be at 3 or 4 in the morning. They couldn't do anything but the most basic information about the chase, about the capture. So reading between the lines, you could tell that it is the slasher, but they're not able to say that. The Sun probably should have said it, but they didn't say it either for some reason. They just had to, they've apparently tried to hedge their bets and say it wasn't, but it's obviously that the Mirror knew a lot of people in the police and could actually get not only this through story that he had identified himself as the slasher when he was arrested, but they were also able to get a photographer out to Kingsgrove police station to see Brian Doyle bringing the slasher into custody. And he's blacked out because identity would be an issue at this stage, and they don't want to obviously prejudice a trial or anything by showing a photo of him before he's actually found guilty. He had a committal hearing, which is a 3-day hearing to try and work out what the charges, whether there would be any charges or would go to trial. And as we can see, this is just from one day of the Mirror. There's 2nd page, 3rd page. So they just went hammer and tong on the coverage, just page after page for the whole 3 days. And here again, in terms of the underage victims, they would publish their names, ages, address, street name, street number, street name, and suburb, and photos. So you could literally walk up to their house, knock on the door and talk to them, which is a very strange, it's just very, as a journalist today, it's very strange because, as I said, you just wouldn't do that today. They'd be protected. And certainly as a minor, you would never, ever be able to use their names in media coverage. This is an actual transcript from the committal hearing. They were sealed by the court at the time for 75 years. So I'd actually had to petition the court to release them so I could actually have a look at them. That's Margaret Collins' testimony. That's Elaine Erdley, who was aunt of one of the victims staying in the same room. She was the only person who actually hit the slasher. She reached out into the window and hit him in the face with her shoe, high-heeled shoe that she had. She's the only person who actually attacked the slasher back. That is in reference to statements from the slasher himself about what he was doing. And there's the origins of, or what he says is the origins of why he did it. He liked to be chased, which is pretty much a falsehood. Whether he knows it or not, I don't know. This is a section that I found interesting because I used it on the back of the book. He's asked to estimate how many houses and backyards he would have been in since he's been doing this. And he answers, no, it would be terribly hard to say. Would it be hundreds or would it be thousands? There's many hundreds, perhaps thousands. So that's, if you think about it, if you're living in there at the time and someone in your street had the slasher in their house, chances are pretty high that he was in your house before then as well, because he wouldn't just go to one house and that'd be it for the day. He'd be prowling for hours and going into plenty of houses and backyards all the while. We've got some fingerprints and palm prints that were taken from various houses that were used as evidence, and they were able to confirm that Scanlan's fingerprints matched. This is the trial. Before they actually have the trial, he pleads guilty, which means it's effectively just sentencing now. They've got to work out how long to jail him for. So he's guilty, and he's been given 18 years in jail, to which he apparently said to the guys in the jail when he went out that it was a bit hot, meaning he thought it was a bit too much, excuse me, a bit much to be giving that sort of sentence. And that is his gravestone. You can see born 1929, died in 1995. That's at Richmond. In conclusion, I can tell you he sort of was fairly quiet afterwards. He was paroled in 1970. From what I can gather from actually a woman who was his daughter after he left jail. He lived with his brother and sister-in-law in Sydney for a while, then moved to the north coast, the central coast rather, where he met a woman who'd already had several children. They married, had another child who was the woman I spoke to, worked in the steel works up there. As far as I know, never committed another crime. And ultimately, yeah, he passed away in 1995. And that should be it. I was looking at the time, went a bit over, but we got there in the end. Yeah, I didn't realize quite how much there was until I had to go and speak through it all. So I'm happy to have any questions now.
Thank you, Glenn. It's just fascinating, I think, that you bring a journalist's knowledge and sensibility to that story, which is told predominantly through accounts in the newspapers. And then, of course, it was great that you had access to the court transcripts. There is one question that I saw come up in the chat, and that's from Sandra asking, at what point did the police work out the identity of the slasher? It sounds like it was quite towards the end of their chase.
When they arrested him is the truth. He was a clean skin, so he committed no crimes. He had no criminal record. So really, they had fingerprints, but obviously fingerprints. If you've never been fingerprinted, your fingerprints aren't on file. So fingerprints in that case are only good once you've actually got someone in custody, so you can actually compare the fingerprints too. And when he was arrested at crossing the bridge to Turrella station, he got caught, and he asked to speak to Detective Doyle, and he went, "Yep, I'm your man. I'm the slasher." And that's when they knew who the slasher was.
That's making me curious to read your book, because there's so many psychological questions that you've raised today. I think, why was he ready to give himself up, and why did other women want to be seen to be victims of the slasher as well? But I won't ask you to get there to answer them, because we've got a question from Julie who's asking, was his wife ever suspicious, his first wife?
You would think so, but it doesn't seem to be the case. There might be some interviews with her in police files, which I didn't have access to. They talk about he was a runner and a fitness freak, so he would sometimes say he was going out for a run late at night, and she was apparently a heavy sleeper, so wouldn't hear him when he came in, which I don't know. I sort of think, I'm married, and at some stage you wake up and you see there's no one in the bed next to you. You sort of think, well, that's a bit strange. Later on, when they moved to Arncliffe, he would say he was working late, and then he would get off at Turrella and go into the bush and change into his prowling gear. And he took that ruse to such a degree that when he would hand his pay packet over to his wife, he would make sure there was some extra money in there to cover this alleged overtime that he told his wife he was doing. So right. It really seems that she even got him to put, they're called slasher bars, which are those iron bars placed on the windows of people's houses to stop someone from getting in. His wife actually got him to put slasher bars on the windows of their own house because she was afraid of the slasher getting in, because she didn't actually realize he already had.
Wow. Ironic, isn't it?
Yes. And she served as not surprisingly, she served him divorce papers while he was in jail.
Right, of course.
It had to be on the grounds of desertion. It couldn't actually be, because it was back in the day, you had to have a socially acceptable reason to divorce someone. You couldn't just go, you're a criminal, I'm going.
Yes, and a legally acceptable reason to divorce someone too, yes. So Tony says, thank you, very interesting and informative. Someone else Tina is saying, amazing and terrifying story. Janet is asking, how did you find out about the story of the Kingsgrove Slasher? And I think you briefly talked about that at the very beginning, Glenn.
Yeah. I grew up in Kingsgrove, and I remember hearing very exaggerated stories from my cousin about what had happened. He would talk about women were walking around the streets carrying knives and swords to protect themselves. It wasn't, just was a slight exaggeration, and you'd hear this, I guess these urban myths sort of come around, and I would never see anything about him in true crime anthologies. It just sort of seemed he slipped through the cracks. And so it was only a couple of years about a year or so before I decided to write the book, I just thought, well, I actually just want to know what happened. How bad was it? Was it, was it all overstated as some people have seemed to think? So I just started, going on the great online archive trove, looking through things, and then spending quite a few hours at the State Library going through the Sun and the Telegraph and the Mirror, which were the main sources of coverage. And then you just sort of find out a lot of stuff that probably hadn't seen the light of day since the 50s, because people think he was just a minor criminal who just cut a few bed sheets.
Yeah, and I just want to recognise the research that you would have had to do, because Trove generally cuts out around 1955 because of copyright laws, and most of your newspaper sources were from 1956 when the Slasher commences.
Yes.
Through to 1950. Yes.
Exactly a year or two after the copyright, yeah.
Exactly, so a lot of hours of microfilm there, I can empathise.
Yeah. I sort of, when I write books, I don't write them to, I guess, make money. I write them because I figure this book needs to exist. It needs to fill a niche in the bookshelf somewhere of history.
Yeah.
So it's just, and if I'm enjoying writing it, it's not a hassle to have to sit there and go through microfilm for hours. Just got to make sure you don't get distracted by looking at the 1950s ads and all the other things.
Exactly. Susan's got a question, and this might have to be the last one because we are over time. What was the psychiatric assessment of him while he was in jail? Was there one done?
There was several done, both by the defence and by the prosecution in terms of the sentencing. Defence effectively believed the idea that he wanted to be chased. They said it was not a literal chase. They all liked the idea of, the police were narrowing in, closing in on him, the media was closing in on him. That sort of thing. But the slasher himself actually said he hated that because it actually made it harder for him to do the job. So I just tend to think if he was interested in the chase, then he probably would have enjoyed the attention, but he hated it. I think the police psychiatrist probably hit the nail on the head and said that there was a sexual motive in it, for sure. So much so that, and it was so deep-seated that even Scanlon probably wasn't aware of it himself. So he would have, and that sort of makes sense to me. It just seems the pattern of escalation seemed to be a bit odd, that the early ones were the violent ones, and it's not until he comes back that there's more groping, more of a sexual thing going on. It becomes more of a sexual assault. So I think the later ones is ones where he's come to terms with what he wants and why he's doing it. So he's able to let free rein go and do what he wants. And I think it's probably good that he got caught, because I think it would have escalated even further if it had have gone on.
Yes, we're all, speaking as a woman that lives alone, we're all very, very glad that he's been caught, and that we have good safety, lighting and in our streets and neighbourhood groups today to help us feel safer as well.
Yeah, and I think if this happened today, it would be the same level of coverage that it was in the 50s. It certainly would be front page of papers. There'd be outrage. There'd be fear. It would have happened all over again. It wasn't a reaction that's exclusive to those times.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Glen. On behalf of everybody, there's been some other comments in the chat there saying thank you to you for a very interesting talk. Glen's book is available via his website, lastdayofschool.net. I also would like to recommend next Friday's talk, which will be by Janet Pelosi, and it will be about firefighters, volunteer firefighters from the Bayside area. First of all, starting with the Rockdale Volunteer Fire Brigade and then other volunteer fire brigades. So people that help us feel safe as a counterpoint to Glen's story today. And we have, as I said, other lunch and learn events on every day of the week. And I've put the link for our Eventbrite site in the chat. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Hope you can get outside and enjoy the sunshine this afternoon in our lockdown situation. Have a lovely weekend, everybody. Bye for now. Thanks, Glen.
No worries.